Hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday, and welcome to another exciting edition of Craft Beer and Brewing's live webinar series. We're super happy to see you today. We'll let a few minutes for everyone to trickle in, but we'll go ahead and start with introductions, and we'll get the session going. So my name is Nate Tarantino. I am a product director at Encompass Technologies, the leader in maker-to-market software for the modern beverage industry. And I have the great privilege of moderating today's webinar, The New Growth Equation, Meeting Demand with a Lean Brewery Mindset. So first, thank you to Craft Beer and Brewing for hosting this session, and to all attendees for taking time out of your busy days to participate in what we hope and what you'll find is an engaging conversation. Before we get started, just a couple quick housekeeping notes. So if you have not attended one of these sessions before, absolutely encourage you to submit any and all burning questions that you may have for our esteemed panel as you have them. And I'm going to do my best to keep up with those comments and sprinkle them throughout the conversation. But we do have plenty of time today. And if we don't happen to get to your question, I'll do my best to get to it at the dedicated Q&A time at the end of our session. All right. Now, we're going to cover a lot of topics today, but we're all going to be talking about a central problem on the mind of so many operators today. What can I do to not just survive, but thrive in a maturing craft market with an ever-evolving consumer palate? So we're going to unpack this problem from both an operator and a market analyst perspective to see where these points of view converge. Maybe they'll differ. Talk about what strategies brands are finding success with. And then ultimately, how does data and technology ultimately help best position all of us and all of our organizations for many years of success in the future? All right. So without further ado, I'm super pumped to be joined by two powerhouses in their own right. So first, Amy Taylor, who has a long history of operational and leadership excellence, and is the quality and process engineer at Toppling Goliath Brewing Company out of Decorah, Iowa. As a critical cog to Toppling Goliath's operational success, I'm super excited to hear from Amy about Toppling Goliath's journey within and beyond beer, and ultimately about the mindset and tactics that they employ to stay relevant and ultimately find growth. So welcome, Amy, and thanks for joining. And then the man, the myth, the legend, we're also joined by Brian BK Krueger, the Vice President of Business Development and Portfolio Strategy at Bump Williams Consulting. If you've never met Brian, or BK, as you'll often hear me call him, is a legend in the industry with over 20 years in the beverage alcohol arena. BK lends his experience and expertise to beverage brands with advisory services ranging from sales and sales support, training, organizational development, sales programming, field quality assurance, you name it. I'm sure I've missed quite a bit of your CV, BK, so please bear with me. But I have had the personal privilege of working with BK in my past supplier days, and can absolutely attest to the breadth and depth of knowledge that both BK and the team at Bump Williams have. And so I'm excited to share that with all of you today.
Thanks, Nate. Pleasure to be here.
All right. Now that that's out of the way, let's go ahead and dive in and have some fun. Again, if you have questions along the way, go ahead and drop that in the chat, and we'll do our best to kind of sprinkle them throughout, all right? So, it's really hard to kind of get going and start talking about the new growth equation without at least acknowledging, the evolution we've all experienced in the industry over the last few years, and ultimately where we are today. So, Amy, I'd love to kind of get started with you. And, Toppling Goliath has certainly made a name for itself with big IPAs, delicious barrel-aged stouts. But if you look over the last 3 to 5 years, the market, and to some extent Toppling Goliath, looks quite a lot different. Can you kind of give your perspective on the market shift that you guys have seen, and maybe how Toppling Goliath has navigated that over the last 3 years to culminate where you are today?
Yeah, you definitely nailed that. We're definitely most known for our hazy IPAs and best in the world stouts, and have had to change, our mission from not only creating and providing the best beer experience in the world to the best beverage experience in the world. And that's something that we talk about regularly within our facility. So our executive brewmaster has carried, that high level of quality that he has, and energy towards the beer into other categories. So we've jumped into seltzers, spirits, recently THC, which we'll get into, I think, as this carries on. And then I would just also comment on the evolution of the market as well. There's new categories within the beverage industry, but then also just the pack format changes have evolved a lot. And that's something I'll definitely touch on throughout the session as well, that the expanded pack format options, the change in pack format options is equally as important and challenging as the categories themselves.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. It's hard to not look far to figure out where Toppling Goliath has evolved. Straight to your website, you see a big splashing image of Mary Rain, your THC spiked water. So tell us a little bit about that. When did that product launch? And maybe give us a little bit of a background of what led Toppling Goliath to kind of get into some of these emerging categories.
Yeah, so we launched it basically the end of last year or the start of this year. So it's still very new for us. It's definitely.
Oh, might have lost Amy. BK, are you still with us?
I still got you.
Cool. All right. We'll see if her Wi-Fi comes back. But I'm sure the story that Amy is currently speaking to that we can't hear will be one that resonates with you, and certainly one that you've kind of heard across the country, right? Breweries are having to adapt. The market is certainly maturing. The old way of going to market with the same brands and styles, not necessarily finding success, or, as the data you guys see and the brands that you talk out in the market, maybe get a little bit of flavor of your perspective.
Yeah, our perspective is, the industry's always been about variety. Consumers specifically have been grounded in something, or they find an entry point, but then they like to branch out from there. What's changed is the frequency that they come back and the variety that's now available to them. So when we're looking at the industry, it's not just the beer industry. And we've had that view for the last 3 to 5 years, especially as we've had the experience of working with everybody outside of craft beer and then wine and spirits and now non-alc and THC across the board. And what's been interesting for us to watch is kind of the interplay between all of them and the shifting around. And then what's the latest layer that's getting added on is where the consumer is and how much of alcohol, THC, or non-alc they are consuming, and what are the occasions for that. So same perspective that Amy has. And I think Toppling Goliath is a great example of seeing where the consumer is, and that alignment with where the consumer is, that's where the retailer is going to go. And that's also where the distributor is going to have to go. So staying ahead of the curve, but doing it in a way that is true to their brand and who they are kind of at the source, but gathers more consumers coming into the space, not just from beer. So I think if you are limiting yourself to just the beer world, you're definitely limiting the potential that you have. And then the flip side of that is getting outside of beer. If you're a craft brewer or a traditional brewer, is not for everyone. There are things that you can do within that lane as well, as far as still playing to that variety and maintaining that consumer base. But we're seeing all of this come together, come to a head. And I think the next 18 months are going to be really interesting for everybody to watch, because we think some of these trends that we're seeing kind of go through the roof are going to start to fall back and settle back in. And we're going to have to adjust to that new reality then as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. And we'll absolutely unpack some of those, in more detail as we go along, right? Participating in some of these emerging categories, or at least trying to capture the evolving consumer, takes a lot of different shapes and forms, right? And so, ultimately there's a lot of data, a lot of internal soul searching you got to figure out what is your play. And, with that, we'll kind of jump back to Amy and hear how Toppling Goliath really ultimately rationalize the market trends, the consumer trend. And Amy, if you want to pick up on Mary Rain and the decision to kind of get into the THC space late last year, that would be great. Oh, looks like you're on mute. Sorry.
Yeah, not sure where exactly I cut off, but so we started Mary Rain at the beginning of this year. Our flavors were very much inspired by some of our seltzers and that technology. So they, kind of worked hand in hand, and one led to the other, which was really exciting. From that standpoint, we're definitely eager to grow in ways that are supporting our consumer base, but then also how can we create new fans kind of jumping into, like, we definitely use both internal sales and distribution data. We use market data and feedback from our wholesalers to guide areas that we have opportunity. We have really good relationships with our wholesalers, so love to hear their feedback. Definitely took those opportunities and that white space that was in front of us to seek out, beverage spaces that remain in alignment with who we are. I think BK kind of touched on that as well, is like, not everything is for us. And, just because it is white space in our portfolio does not necessarily mean we need to jump into it. So we do spend a lot of time contemplating that piece. It's like, who are we and how does this align with our mission of, providing the best beverage experience in the world. So, and then again, just looking at not only those opportunities within different categories, but also the pack formats has been something we've kept our eye on.
Yeah, thanks, Amy, and glad to have you back. So, like, great questions, and that's actually a great segue into kind of the next topic that we wanted to kind of open up to is, you're exactly right. Just because there is white space doesn't mean it's right for you, right? And there's a lot of internal and external data factors that kind of come into that analysis of whether it's organizational readiness to jump in, if it's a cultural fit to kind of jump into a new category. And so kind of give us a little bit of an understanding of maybe the framework that you guys have used internally to determine, what is the right space to jump in at? And then with that, what kind of signals are you looking for out in the market or operational data, or maybe even hearing directly from your consumers in the tap room that maybe help give you some of that validation or confidence that getting into that category is the right step for you guys?
Yeah, so obviously all the data that I just shared and whatnot was used, points of distribution, rate of sale, that type of thing. We also like to use a lot of almost like anecdotal feedback and like hear what people are excited about and passionate about. People that work at a brewery enjoy the craft and they enjoy the industry, and so it's really fun to hear from them. Like, hey, what are you excited about? People that come into our tap room, same thing, like you said, is like, what are they asking for? What are they interested for? And leading with what our consumers are interested in has been a really fun thing to do.
Yeah. And to follow up on that, BK, I think Amy mentioned, right, there's a plethora of data out there. Internal data within your own ERP, your taproom POS, monitoring consumer behavior and trends there. There's a ton of external data as well. Very easy to kind of get lost and start drowning in all the available data at your fingertips potentially. And so, from your perspective, thinking about a brewer who maybe is stagnant and has been on the sidelines, trying to streamline, be as lean as they can, but at the end of the day, we got to find growth where we can. What are some of the data points that you find are like most critical when you're advising brands when they're assessing their portfolio and ultimately assessing their own readiness to expand into a new category?
Yeah, and with us, there has to be that base and data points. There also has to be, for those brewers that you're talking about, kind of an overall mentality about it as far as they treat their business and each subset of their business as its own P&L. So you have to be looking at profit and loss. So sometimes you have to monitor that through internal, which is the easiest way, but then external. So internal, I think Amy nailed them all, like sales, distribution, rate of sale, share, pricing, profitability. You have to be looking at those on a regular basis, not just when you need to make decisions about the future. You need to be managing your business in that way on down the line. And then that helps you determine kind of how efficient are you. And I know efficiency and focus are two of the biggest buzzwords that we have in the industry right now. But in lean times, you absolutely have to be efficient in the brands that you have, and then in the ones that you are looking to bring to market. Profitability, and then again with that P&L mentality through all that internal data, is kind of treating it as an EBITDA, kind of that internal financial scorecard that you can use for overall financial health. On the external, it's the environment, it's the lay of the land, it's benchmarks as far as what's going on in the industry, what are the category growths, what are other industries doing, what are other segments doing as far as non-alc, as far as wine and spirits. Getting data or having access to data on that can help you to inform your decisions. And then it starts to layer down from that. Kind of what else, if we're looking at benchmarks, how am I doing? Because we do need to keep score. Retailers are keeping score. Accounts are keeping score for us. you need to be keeping score internally. And that looks to things as far as what is a good rate of sale within an account? What is a good level of points of distribution? What is a good rate of growth? Or what is a good share percentage to be putting up on the board right now? So those are the numbers that we look at on the external side. Those are probably some of the most common ones, but can't hit it hard enough that you need to be looking at those, not just your internal, but comparing it to the external. And then what's most important is it's not just an internal metrics. That's maybe how you make decisions, but it's also how you form your stories for something that you have, something that maybe you want to swap, or something that you want to transition into as well.
Yeah, so you kind of touched on a topic I want to go one more level deeper on, right? So, we very quickly kind of jumped into emerging categories as a source of growth. I'm curious, you guys crunch a lot of data, you guys do a lot of advising of other brands, but is there any data or any kind of signal that you see in the market that by rationalizing a portfolio, by slimming down the SKUs that you take to market, that you can get some of that velocity back through like increased focus with your distribution network, or potentially like having that better story to chain, knowing that shelf price keeps shrinking, right? It's not going to keep growing forever. Do you see that strategy kind of playing out in the data of intentional SKU rationalization as a mechanism for getting higher velocity on everything else?
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of the way we like to frame it is it's not a reactionary type of analysis. It's being proactive as far as looking at that. You should be focusing. And I think it was one of our newsletters at the end of last year where we talked about brands that focus. And by bringing down the number of SKUs, by reducing the amount of categories they're in, not saying they can't be in multiple categories, but not chasing everything, not having a seltzer, a cider, a non-alc, an RTD, an FMB, and all of those. That's just like adding 4 or 5 different SKUs into your portfolio. So it has to be a focus and prioritization with each level. But short answer is yes, those companies that do focus, we see a better return as far as what they're putting in the market. We see their trends increase. We see they may not go completely positive because a lot of times that's not the reality for the overall alcohol environment that we're in. But we do see those benefits, especially if you mix that up with this is the right thing to focus with because it's aligned with where the consumer is, where the retailer is, where my distributor is, what they have room to focus on, what may fill a hole in their portfolio as well, or occupy a priority location. Yeah. No secret sauce. You have to be able to look at each one of those elements. But yes, absolutely, focus will pay back.
Yeah, it's so counterintuitive, right? Because there's so many breweries out there with excess capacity, and it's so easy to jump to the right decision is I need to launch a new brand to help fill that tank space, fill that idle people capacity, right? And Amy, this is where I really love to just get your opinion again, right? You're engineering by background, you are trained and taught value engineering, cost engineering, squeeze efficiency out. So how do you guys look at like your internal data, whether it's equipment utilization, people time, and your own kind of operational readiness, and how does that factor into your kind of SKU decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the KPIs that we look at from a higher level would be like the overall revenue and margin, especially as the styles and consumers are choosing different styles over other styles, even within this beer category. Our mix has significantly changed our overall revenue and margin, even though our barrelage may be very comparable. So that's something that we are definitely looking at. And then you mentioned like the capacity, and that's both equipment and people. And so we have done, both initiatives to increase our output by, bringing in equipment that, pulls off more juice from the dry hop or increases our transfer volumes. So we've definitely done some of that work, but then, knowing whether we bring in something new or not, it's like, hey, let's look at our capacity as well, and just see where we're at, both on the people and equipment side.
Yeah, and you guys are roughly 6 months into your journey of kind of launching Mary Rain. BK kind of mentioned kind of a P&L mindset of kind of tracking each of these categories, uniquely. That way you can kind of track profitability. Is that something that you guys are doing, or is that part of your evolution of kind of maturing your internal KPIs and that the health status of, these brands as you start to launch them?
Yeah, definitely something we, I would say both. We got kind of one foot in both camps, right?
Yeah.
Definitely are talking about how the Mary Rain is performing, understanding how much we've produced and like what that path looks like, but also expanding the KPIs that we are looking at, and understanding, them at a higher, different levels. So definitely both.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So maybe you can kind of get us into a story. And so, we talk about planning and organizational readiness for new SKUs. We're never going to be able to plan perfectly. Some of, organizations are in different level of their own maturity curve. And so, there's always going to be blind spots you don't have. And so, I'm curious to just kind of go down, a path of whether it was launching Mary Rain or kind of getting into spirits the last handful of years. Kind of take us down a path of, one of the expansions that you did decide to go down. What were maybe some of the assumptions you had kind of going into it that maybe didn't play out in reality? And how would you kind of change your assessment moving forward? I think it's always helpful to have that kind of continuous improvement in the mindset, knowing we're not going to nail the launch on the first try. And so I'm just kind of curious to hear how your real life and Toppling Goliath's real life experience could potentially help others accelerate that learning curve, for themselves.
Yeah, this is an exciting topic and probably something we could spend a whole additional hour digging into each of the categories we've expanded into and the challenges and rewards of each specific one. But yeah, jumping into THC and like Mary Rain specifically, like I mentioned earlier, we do have really good relationships with our wholesalers. We meet with them at least quarterly, some monthly, some weekly, some daily, right? But to just like take a high level look at the business at least quarterly and annually to dig into, hey, what's working, what are areas that we need to explore? And this has been an area that there's been some excited nervousness, I would say. Everybody's wondering, is THC the next big thing? But also there's just this whole moving target and regulations are in flux. So kind of jumping into that, we did take the leap of faith and jumped into it. Some of the complexities that we've experienced, again, it's a very dynamic category with moving targets on like the regulations, and even what we found is that there's uniqueness within each state, very specific potency limits within each state that make it very, very interesting. So in Iowa specifically, we're not permitted to produce certain potencies that would be allowed outside of Iowa. And so just wanting to get into that market automatically challenged us to find a partner that would be able to do that brewing, blending, packaging outside of the state to produce and warehouse that product. And just by, introducing that element has created a whole new set of challenges within not being at our facility across the entire supply chain. So everything from, just the demand planning, it's not like you can just like, the data is not as accessible on this market. And so to like pick out and say, hey, like what's a good target on how many points of distribution and rate of sale that we can see. It's very anecdotal and working with your partners to understand it. There's not like a lot of great data to just go and see how many SKUs are on the shelf and what their rate of sale and what, that doesn't necessarily exist within the THC realm. So kind of that's on the demand planning, the uncertainty, warehousing, again, we can't store, produce all that, some certain potencies in Iowa. So finding like third-party warehousing able to support order fulfillment. So because they can't necessarily reside in our facility, it's like not only just a warehouse, but a warehouse that can support order fulfillment with a high level integrity, manage and monitor our inventory, and just be a super reliable source. And then freight, just another piece of that supply chain. We exclusively use cold chain logistics with beer. Primarily FTL and shared FTL for beer. So now, it's like contemplating dry freight and when it makes sense to utilize dry freight versus load sharing versus and having warehouses that are hours apart from each other. So just a handful of, complexities that not being able to have it at our facility has introduced into that by us getting into that category. Just some other things that we had to consider. We had a desire for our offering to remain in a slim can, which we also don't have capability of here. So just some important factors as we found, we were looking for a partner to Copac, like, can they do slims? Our identity is very heavily in paperboard. We prefer that. We want to put our art and our marketing front and center. So having that capability, maybe not today, but long term to grow into, is definitely an important piece for us. And then just, either way, them sizing up appropriately with us to support as we grow that category. And then I would say the last, but definitely not least, important thing for us to consider, and that we still have to shuffle things around, is like the people support. Who's managing those relationships, who, from everything from our sales team, like BK kind of talked through, like, by adding a category, you add a new SKU essentially. So when we walk through the door, we have a new SKU that we're competing with. Maybe they're not on the same shelf together, but how many priorities do you get to present to the buyer when you walk in through the door? You don't get them all, right? And so that does compete against what are our own priorities. So definitely influencing our sales team from that standpoint, that our wholesale partners, and then internally the supporting from invoicing and partner relationship and all that stuff. So yeah.
That's good. And definitely want to get into the kind of the usage of co-packers and how that fits in today's market, here in a few minutes. Maybe before we kick it back over to BK to kind of expand on that a little bit more, being the kind of quality and process engineer, how do you guys think about quality for some of these new categories kind of going in for the first place, right? Some of these, head brewers and brewmasters have years or decades of experience perfecting the art of craft beer. Flavor profiles, consistency, totally different in different categories. So, is that an element that you guys thought about up front and, wanted to ensure, any kind of quality of a brand new launch would be consistent with the, overall consumer expectation of Toppling Goliath?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you asked that question. Our executive brewmaster has been very hands-on with our co-packer, and did a lot of bench topping internally here, and then was absolutely present or testing samples before we would move forward in production to ensure that it matched or exceeded the quality of the bench top samples and what he was working towards carried through in the large scale production. I would say there's definitely been a couple of iterations, or it hasn't always been a home run on the first time, and has definitely taken some back and forth to get that recipe nailed down before we move forward with packaging. And then, in the THC market, it is very common to be extremely transparent on your potencies for each specific batch. And so that is something that's not new internally for us, but new externally, and having that level of transparency. And so, making sure that we send every batch out for COAs, having them posted so that consumers have access to them before we ever send it to distribution. So absolutely.
And BK, I'm sure you've advised many brands on, launching into new territories, or maybe, brands launching from scratch, right? So maybe give an example of, maybe the common myths or misconceptions people have when they jump into this new category. How maybe you've helped correct that with the data you're seeing in the market, and ultimately setting people up for sustainable, profitable growth. There's very easy to get kind of trapped and lost, and THC is going to be the next beer. It's going to take over the market, in the next 5 years. So how do you guys kind of, wade through those misconceptions or those myths, and, really reinforce the importance of data and data-driven decisions when you guys are really launching these new products?
Yeah, the misconceptions, especially as you're going outside a category, is it's going to be easy. I've got this figured out. I've been doing this for a while. It's the same. Beverage alcohol or beer is some of the most complicated as far as distribution and tiers and relationships that there is. every single category that you go into has its subtleties, it has its complications, it has its complexities. So the more that you can do your homework before you go in there and talk to people that are in that space, rely on the distributors that you're going to build a long-term relationship with for market data, for kind of everything from legal to how do you deal with retailers to how do you support the market, what's permissible, what's not permissible. Those are the things that we like to talk people through. But there's also warnings out there that it isn't for everyone. And oftentimes the learning curve is going to take you away from other focuses that may be more core and central to your business right now. So over prepare as far as resources and investment that you're going to be putting to those. Plan for the complexities. If you get a streamlined process and it goes through on the first time, you are definitely in the minority because everybody has to learn and kind of take their lumps along the way. Good for you. And most of the time, if you have had a smooth process, it's because you've been better prepared. And that goes back to everything that you've been doing in your business, things that you've learned as a 5-year brewer or a 10 or a 15. It's a different mindset than you had coming into it with the first batches. And you just have to reset the table and say, I'm coming at this brand new. I'm going to be open to learning. I know that there's going to be some mistakes, but I've learned from my past business that I'm going to ask more questions. I'm going to dig deeper. I'm going to establish better relationships and prepare for more things into the future.
Yeah. And I think that leads back to your point of the need for efficiency and having that lean mindset, right? Because whatever effort and investment you think it's going to take to launch that brand and be successful, double it, triple it, right? Absolutely prepare for the inevitability and having that kind of capital efficiency and capital flexibility to really make sure that you're making the investments in the right space, absolutely seems critical, in some of these emerging categories.
Yeah. If you're not an efficient organization right now, it's definitely going to stress you going into trying to expand into other categories. And whether you're expanding into other categories or segments or subsegments, one of the things that we tell everybody is you should be looking internally at your efficiencies. And that's not just cost cutting or kind of maximizing. It's how do we operate as an organization? How do we communicate? How's our goal setting? How's our planning? How's our national accounts? How are our distributor relationships? And I think Amy's mentioned just about every single one of those elements in there. And those are all a part of being an efficient organization. Those are the ones that are succeeding right now, even in this challenging environment, or those are the ones that are having more success being able to go into other areas. So absolutely focus on internal and then use those learnings and then apply them going to something that you don't know a lot about right now.
Yeah, that makes total sense. We talked about data and the role of data and making sure that you understand the market, understand the consumer, understand the space before you jump in. For beer, wine, and spirits, the data pipeline has been around forever, right? I don't know how many hours I've consumed information from BWC, which is obviously compiled from Nielsen and IRI. We've all combed over and bled over distributor reports, whether it's sales and inventory data. I think Amy really hit a point on the head, right? It's, for some of these categories, there just isn't a whole lot of data out there, right? And so, as the data maestro yourself, BK, what do you see as, what's coming up around the corner on getting some aggregated market data for some of this data to help these operators make better decisions? Or in the absence of the data, what are you advising brands who are kind of investing or investigating that space now, what data should they go and look for that maybe is available that they're under leveraging today?
Sure. Specifically on the THC, there's not a lot of syndicated data available. I mean, people are absolutely flying blind as far as syndicated data. There are some elements of that coming into the picture, probably more sooner than later, but it's still just capturing a small portion of the THC market, and the level of detail isn't there. It's evolving really fast. It's one of the most frequent questions that we get is, where can I get the data? And if we're not relying on syndicated data for it, you have to rely on ground level intelligence. And that's other people that are in the space, if they're distributors, if there are other suppliers that maybe you have a partnership with. It's understanding the lay of the land in that particular segment or category that you're going into, as far as number of accounts, what's the right pack size, What's the right price points? What are the right flavors? What is it that consumers are responding to? What is it retailers are thirsty for? What do they want to see more of? Looking at internal data from markets, maybe you're kind of just getting into that area. Establishing benchmarks, using those metrics to kind of establish that base, and then using those to set goals going forward with the intelligence, developing deeper relationships. At some point, it has to become a relationship game, and that's kind of the best source of this information. But use your internal data as much as you can. And then if you see a gap or a blind spot in that, figure out somebody else that you can talk to. Maybe it's a trade association. Maybe it's an alliance of distributors that are going on. Maybe it's retailers. Maybe it's going out to all the conferences and the seminars and establishing deeper relationships. Those that are succeeding are also those that are best connected within that industry. And they have to make an effort in that investment to go out and seek that knowledge. Just because you can't click a button and download a report on it doesn't mean that there's not somebody out there that can give you great insight and a few of the specifics for you to make better decisions.
Yeah, that's perfect. And Amy, I know you mentioned this point earlier, and we're going to come back and to get more detail on it, right? Curious to unpack just how much of like your wholesale network or maybe other folks in your network helped kind of supplement the data as you guys were planning your launch. There's data coming from all over the place. It's hard to aggregate that data efficiently and quickly to make, timely decisions. But we're certainly seeing a lot of interest in the middle tier, the wholesale tier of taking on THC beverages, kind of expanding their services to capture this category as well. Some of that means we're entering into new points of distribution that these wholesalers have never been a part of, right? We're talking about hemp shops that don't have alcohol. It's a totally different route to market for them as well. And so maybe share some insight of, how much did your wholesaler network kind of work with you or potentially even push you guys to kind of get into this space? And how did you kind of leverage their data, work with them and their data to ultimately formalize a launch plan that everyone felt, comfortable and confident with?
Yeah, so I would say in some cases, so in all cases, they've definitely been super helpful in terms of like identifying accounts and like, as a partnership and where we need to be. In some cases, it's been like, hey, we need a product to compete in against our competitors, and this is where we need your help. Okay. And in some cases, it's not necessarily that, but hey, here's where we're having a lot of luck. I would say the biggest maybe challenge that we have is, this uncertainty in the hemp beverage or hemp network is translating to like chains and stuff like that. So a lot of the growth in this area has been in the independent because there's some chains that are not necessarily super excited to jump into it just with the uncertainty. And so that's been a challenge, but also something that we continue to run hard against and definitely start to see some breakthroughs. Yeah.
Yeah, and independents are notoriously a hard channel to get, syndicated data out of. I've certainly spent a lot of time, over a beer with BK, trying to unpack, share in independence and how do we drive better velocity and distribution there. Same time, I went to Total Wine a couple weeks ago, and there's now an entire row of shelves dedicated to CBD and THC, right? And so, everyone is definitely on their own journey of kind of adopting that category. Chains are no exception there. And I think, the emphasis of working on your wholesaler network or leaning on your wholesaler network for that data and that intelligence in the absence of more aggregated data, makes total sense, right? That's certainly what we've been doing all along in beer as we've thought about different styles that have kind of come in and out of that. And so, leaning on that experience just in this new world, seems like a natural place to kind of to be in and kind of move forward on.
Yeah, you definitely.
Sorry, Amy, go for it.
I was just going to say, yeah, there's definitely a lot of both cooler and shelf space resets that are, taking away from beer or taking away from other, different categories and expanding into the THC, kind of on the flip side to what I was saying, and just understanding and jumping into like their deadlines and how to become part of that process. Super important.
Yeah, those conversations with retailers are often overlooked. We talk about the distributor and kind of the data and the syndicated data, but your example of a Total Wine, if you go in and you talk to the beer steward, the wine steward, the THC, whoever it is, they'll tell you what's selling. They'll tell you the pack size, they'll tell you the flavor, they'll tell you the brand, the SKU, give you a good viewpoint as far as what that velocity is. And you can use that intelligence. And you can also ask questions as far as how are they making decisions moving forward with what they're planning on bringing in at that individual retailer level. So everything that we've learned from the beer side of things, as far as best practices, as far as how you go to market and where you should be getting these internal and external data points, apply to the other categories as well. They're just newer people in those categories that we need to go seek out those relationships with.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, as we think about kind of navigating growth, we'll kind of shift topics a little bit into like route to market is a little bit different, I guess, as you think about your options. Historically, there's so much pride in brewing, your own product, having the authenticity, being able to tell that story directly out of your own tap room, serving that pint. Some of these categories, don't necessarily look that same way, right? There's not the storied history of spirits for some brands or for, THC and other brands. And so, talk to Amy and BK, kind of different perspectives here. BK, maybe starting from you, at the end of the day, how much does the consumer, want to connect to the story and the brand of the actual entity that's producing the liquid versus just really resonating with the product itself from its characteristics of flavor, mouthfeel, intoxicating effect, and ultimately the type of occasions that they want to enjoy with it. Are you seeing a perhaps divergence in how people think about the brands and the loyalty they have with these new products versus maybe craft beer historically?
I think we're seeing more of an evolution to that kind of omnibulous consumer, and maybe we were a little bit too reliant, kind of especially on the craft brewing side, is like anything I put out, they love me as a brewer. They may have come to me from my flagship brand, but anything I do, that's where the relationship is. That's fading away, even within craft beer. I mean, you have to have the brands in there for sure. But as far as the point of origin, if it's a co-packer or whatever, with some breweries that maybe have most of the loyal followings, yeah, maybe it's a little bit of a shock. But if it's meeting that occasion and then you're delivering on those brands into a different occasion, a lot of times the consumer's overlooking it. Especially if you look in the world as far as RTDs and FMBs and the amount of co-packing that goes on there. And that's not a negative thing at all. The consumer wants that end result. They want that brand. They want that kind of flavor. They want that association. Whether it came from where you have your craft brewery or your brewery is less and less important. I think you can look at a lot of the celebrity brands, especially on the spirit side and the wine side, and the RTD and FMB side. Point of origin, who's brewing it, really doesn't matter. And a consumer can love one brand and hate another brand, and they're coming from the same exact facility. So less and less important, but you do need to be careful because there are some breweries and some brands that set that level of expectation for them. I think Toppling Goliath is an example of somebody that's kind of navigated through that and was probably pretty cautious about that, and then they've got a feel for it, and now they know what's acceptable and what is not on that.
No, I certainly remember from my supplier days, right? Seltzers were all the clays, hard seltzer, the decision to get into hard seltzers or not. And, so much conflict with the ethos of craft beer in that. But, I'm sure, Amy, for you guys, the conversation was so similar, right? It's at the end of the day, we're able to extend our authenticity and our connection with the consumer that maybe hasn't had an experience with us before, right? Because of a celiac disease or a gluten intolerance or something, right? And so, even though, this may feel inauthentic, this is always an opportunity to kind of extend to your brand, whether you're making the product or not. And so, how much did that resonate with you guys and kind of factor in your guys' decision? And, obviously Toppling Goliath is forefront in all of your guys' products. So there is absolutely no shying away that this is a Toppling Goliath product, as long as your production network can meet your quality standards. So.
Yeah, I would say from a Toppling Goliath standpoint, we definitely still place a very high priority on like the quality of the liquid and the branding and the marketing, as you just expressed, that's something that's like super important to us. And then having an option, getting into the space was, about having an option for consumers at another occasion, was part of what enticed us to jump into the space. And I would say, definitely in our minds about co-packing, it's not our first choice. However, it does allow us to trial and to, test out the market. And I know I've said it a few times, but our executive brewmaster, our quality team is extremely involved in the quality of the product and has had to feel really good about the product during the R&D phase with our co-packer, but then also, before we package now, it is of high importance that liquid meets our standards for sure.
And let's unpack that a little bit, right? So, co-packing, contract brewing, contract distilling, a lot of different words you want to call it, co-manufacturing. At the end of the day, it's such an interesting, evolution in the industry in its own right? Because you could be on either side of that model. I work every day with companies who are contract brewers or are co-packers and offer those services to many of the brands that, we're thinking about today that are finding success in these categories. And that's another example of maximizing the ROI of already deployed capital, right? In times of market shrinking, you have to get more efficient and get more out of your current system. Long gone are the days of multi-million-dollar SBA loans. And so, there is that, side of the market that jumps into co-packing or contract producing as a way to fill that capacity and squeeze out more margin out of, the team and the equipment that's already on site. The benefits of that, as I think about it from my own supplier days, is I get to do what I do best, which is make world-class beer or make world-class products. And maybe, that, as we've talked about with BK&U, I don't have to worry about so much about the route to market and the legal landscape and the patchwork of, regulation that's kind of out there and the uncertainty of how do I go to market in a new category. I can find that growth within, a niche or a strength that I have today, which is just making world-class beer. And then the flip side of that is, you nailed it on the head, Amy, of using co-packers as a low-risk way to kind of dip your toes into that world until you get enough success that you can redeploy that capital, redeploy that equipment, to meet that demand for the future. And so, I know you've talked about this a little bit already, Amy, and you guys are using co-packers. What I've seen from our customer base, here on Encompass, as we talk to co-packers and contract producers all the day, and even those that are using co-packers, is holy smokes, the level of coordination that is required to work with your co-packers on supply chain planning, getting product at the right place at the right time, getting it picked up at the right place at the right time, sent to the right place at the right time, just requires a whole nother level of coordination and commitment from the team. And, it does require you to, rationalize the work that you're doing elsewhere in the business to make time for that. So, from a tooling perspective, Amy, and from a systems perspective, what is working well and what are you guys looking to improve to kind of improve the coordination and the execution of that supply chain activities within your current tech stack?
I think, now that we're past the first few months, we've established good processes and communication cadences. I think, understanding the expectations from both parties is super important. So hey, when do you need to know when production has to happen so that we could proactively plan for that? And so just kind of working through that, when we're ramping up and getting things going initially, it was just it's a little bit of hey, what's our lead time on these new material suppliers? What's our lead time on these new flavorings that we're ordering? And trying to get all these moving pieces to come together. And now we've definitely gotten into a cadence of understanding some of those things and just having really good communication, reciprocating both ways with our co-packer and internally with our sales team. So, that whole demand planning to production process.
Yeah, and certainly if Iowa had different rules, I'm sure at some point you'd love to bring that production back in-house or in-house. but not necessarily on the cards yet. And so, is there anything from a people investment or a technology investment that you guys are doing to facilitate that better working relationship with the co-packers, or find efficiencies to make that process not so hard as you're trying to figure out that cadence?
Yeah, so we have jumped into a few of the lower potencies at our facility that that meet pack formats and occasions and spaces that are preferred and that align with the equipment that we have. So
Yes.
like a 16-ounce can, 5 milligrams is like a common 5 milligram in Iowa is a suitable solution and like accepted versus a slim can. So we are doing some of those now. Very recently, we are getting into those areas. And I think, in time, as we continue to experiment a little bit more with how the lower potencies work, we may jump into equipment that supports doing that here, and take the potencies that we can produce in Iowa, and do them at our facility. So definitely, I would say it's a trial, as well as, leveraging for long-term, if Iowa doesn't come around to the update, new regulations. So
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and BK, as a one who's always keeping the pulse on the market, there's obviously a lot of consolidation happening in the industry. We're seeing breweries team up, kind of making platform plays to find efficiencies at scale. We're seeing joint ventures for contracting and co-packing kind of being launched. In your guys' data that you review, and as you're out there talking to folks in the market, how do you see kind of co-packing and contracting contributing to like the overall market? Do you see it being a long-term strategic shift to find that profitable growth, or are you seeing it more as an interim solution to maybe soften the blows of the ebbs and waves of the market as we've seen over the last couple of years?
No, again, I think we've seen it as an evolution. I mean, even within the brewing side of things, there's been co-packing or joint ventures or those types of relationships. So I don't think that it's a temporary solution. I think that there are co-packers out there, especially on the good side of those, that are very efficient, that know exactly how to make it efficient for the supplier that's coming to them. So they do have that partnership. They can talk them through it. And it becomes so efficient that it's like, why would I want to bring all of this back in-house? Especially if you're looking at going back into expanding geographies and expand like the equipment that you need and the investment. If you can achieve that level of profitability and be comfortable there, then you're not having to invest it internally. And maybe you can spend a little bit more as far as on the pull side, as far as getting it out to what the consumer is going to see. So I think that it is definitely a viable solution. I think it's here to stay. And I think it's part of an increasing number of people's business models going forward. And it's the only way that they can get into the space and set those that may be on the new entrants. But the same is also true as far as people that are established in other categories. This is the most efficient way for them to do that and still focus on what's core to their business and grow both simultaneously instead of having to worry about everything that Amy was talking about. If you're capable of doing it, absolutely do it. But you, again, have to put it through that P&L and make sure it's going to be efficient and be a total plus for the entire organization.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And, we've seen co-packers and contract producers ultimately align into the same ethos that we saw in craft beer, right? If you're launching co-packing or contract services, you're leaning into the strengths and the beers that you are already known, on a world-class basis for. Same thing with you, Amy, right? You guys are known for your IPAs and your big barrel-aged beers. If that world ever opened up to you guys, you do what you do best, right? And that's certainly what I've seen when I engage with a lot of our customers is, if they're going to dabble their toes into offering contract services, is offer the best brands and the best style that you produce today for other brands that have that capacity or have that desire, and the ability to take that new market or a product to market. And so, niche is niche, whether it's your own brand or you're co-packing, you got to know what you do best and stay within your lane. I love that you mentioned that earlier, BK. It's like, you can't just keep launching categories and think you're going to be successful. At the end of the day, you got to, stay true to, what you're doing best today. Right.
Yep, absolutely. And there's always a risk going into a different category. And a lot of times it's absolutely worth it. And it can save your organization and kind of reignite a consumer fire in areas that you weren't able to reach. Other times, cautionary tale, you've taken your mind off the ball, or you've chased a fad and it's put you into a worse financial situation or efficiency situation for your entire organization.
Yeah. And so, we've talked about data a little bit. We've talked about the co-packing model and, both sides of the equation when that can make sense to find growth and maintain that kind of lean mindset. I'd love to talk about from a technology standpoint, just because that's kind of the world I live in every day. Different requirements for different models, whether you're brewing, you're distilling, you're co-packing, working with a co-packer, it brings different challenges, inventory visibility, compliance, getting product delivered at the right time. And then we talk about all the different data that's available internally and externally. How do we get all that data together, review it consistently, not just annually, but review it consistently to continue to fine tune our portfolios and rationalize our SKUs. BK, how much is technology something you talk about with your breweries and your customers when you guys are talking about efficiency? And, ultimately, how do you advise them to get all that data into a platform that you can digest it efficiently and make those decisions and review that data, more timely?
Yeah, we talk about technology all the time. I mean, it's one of the most kind of common topics that we have. You can't move forward in this industry unless you're using the technology. And a lot of time people mistake technology for being, I'm going to get this report, or I'm going to get this app, or I'm going to run 5 different sales systems all at the same time, and everything doesn't talk to each other. So technology is great. Data is great. We like to talk about centralizing and getting things into what we call a business intelligence hub. So things are coming in, specialists are the ones that are manipulating the data and putting it out to those end users so they can spend more time making decisions than running reports. It's great if they have that capability to run those reports, but what is the data that you need to make those decisions? Where are you going to get it from? Who is it going to take to manipulate that so you can spend the most amount of time analyzing it, not running it, and actually making decisions that are going to matter for your organization? And lots of technology platforms that are out there, but still it comes down to a human skill. And still to this day, as far as somebody that can take that, who has conversations with the executive level, with the street level, with the national accounts level, with production, with warehouse, with ordering and processing, to bring that in together. And so again, people can be efficient in their jobs and not have to learn 5 or 7 different languages to do something.
Yep. And then Amy, obviously you guys have made investments in technology over the last couple of years. We've certainly enjoyed having you on our production cloud platform. So, how do you guys, manage your technology, think about getting all the data in a single place, the power of a single platform? Give us a little bit of the journey and the evolution you guys have made in that space to stay competitive, because ultimately we're seeing that as a competitive differentiator, right? The most informed and the ones that are reviewing their data and acting on it quickest are often the ones that are finding the success out in the market. So does that resonate with the kind of cultural shift you guys have seen?
Yeah, I mean, taking a step back from even the data that we're talking about, I have a strong passion for having like everything at your fingertips. So, like flow meters and all the things like very dialed in and available, so you can do real troubleshooting and never have questions on like, hey, what happened? It's like you can answer what happened. So I'm super passionate about that. And that carries into, the data that you're referring to in Encompass and whatnot. It can be very I would say that the data that, up to this point, prior to Encompass, part of our time with Encompass, the data's been there, but it's super time consuming to dig into. And BK just touched on that, but it makes it very challenging to do effective problem solving when you ran out of energy by the time you got through the data. So I think, visibly being able to see trends in both like tables, graph formats, like quickly highlight, your areas of opportunity is super important. And I'm super excited about the progress that we've made so far. And I look forward to, further elimination of spreadsheets and platforms, those separate platforms and workflows, so that we can, the capability of for us, it's like understanding brand registration, understanding points of distribution, rate of sale, taking the points of distribution, rate of sale, and then what they have on order, and being able to see that all together. It's like, hey, do we even have enough beer on order to support what they're asking, or what their current trends are looking like? So I think that stuff is super exciting, on the roadmap ahead. So.
Yeah, data is just part of the process, and you have to incorporate it into all elements. I mean, unless you're turning that data into, as you said, kind of the PowerPoints and Excels and the graphs and the charts, and using it in what you should be using to run your business as far as KPIs and dashboards at all levels in all departments, then it's just a bunch of numbers. So you have to be able to put it to that use to be efficient, like Amy was saying.
Yep.
Yeah, there's absolutely a difference between data and information, right? And I love that you use the business intelligence platform, because that is ultimately key. So much data out there, some that's easier to grab than others, and ultimately, making the investment to build that reporting infrastructure up front, we find definitely pays dividends on the back end, right, where you can actually monitor the success and the launch of these products versus continuing to fly blind as you did when you entered, right? And certainly from a technology standpoint, this is an area that we're looking to help support our customers, and improving efficiency as well. Everyone's talking about AI in the technology world that hasn't yet figured out how to make THC seltzers, but maybe here soon we'll see robots making THC products. But that's absolutely an area that we're focusing on, is infusing AI within our reporting tool to make turning that data into information faster, right? So, if you have someone on staff that is that, data guru, fantastic. If you don't, you still have an option in the platform to efficiently extract the data and the insights that you need, right? So, that's just one example that, is a way I spend a lot of my time trying to help support the lean breweries out there, and making sure that, the best decisions are based on data and, able to be made on a timely manner. So, I love that. I love that journey, Amy. We're all on that journey together. And I think the big first step is ultimately knowing where you have that kind of shortcoming and blind spot within your internal organization, and then making a path to improve it, right? We're never going to be perfect. There's always ways to improve. It's really about having that lean and continuous improvement mindset. That's really key to all of this. So I think with that, I think we're about an hour. Haven't had a ton of questions come in yet. And in fact, we've already covered a couple of them. So, with that, I'll just kind of start the closing wrap up here, and see if there's any kind of parting thoughts or summaries. BK, we'll kind of kick it over to you. As we think about the new growth equation, meeting demand with the lean brewery mindset, what are the 2 or 3 things that you think everyone should be taking away from today as they're kind of preparing themselves, and whatever section or portion of their journey they're on, what would you leave with them?
Yeah, I would lead with make informed decisions, do your homework. And some of that's internal, external data. Some of that's through personal relationships, to decide what is the right thing to you. The other big portion of that is to be an efficient organization, to have systems in place that go all the way from the executive down to the street level and touch every part of your organization. And as a part of those most efficient organizations, those are the ones that are the most adept at obtaining data and then putting it to their best use to make their decisions. I mean, the data that we're getting right now, it's all backward. It's all looking kind of in the rearview mirror. You have to be able to translate that into what's going on now, apply it to your organization, and then apply it farther into the future as far as those decisions that you need to make. And if you don't have the right data, you need to know where to go to look for it. I like to think that we're a good source of that. And then more valuable than that is also in how do you apply it. But do your homework and be prepared on those.
Yeah. And then Amy, you guys are still obviously in the middle of your journey, but having success so far, which is fantastic. And, love watching and continue to watch, what you guys do. Any kind of 2 or 3 things as other organizations are on the sidelines thinking about growth. How do I get it? How do I not just survive, but thrive? What were the 2 or 3 things that you would kind of leave with those folks today so that they feel, a little bit more prepared of how they would prepare themselves internally or externally to, to really adapt and evolve, moving forward?
I would say, one of the most important things, addressing your question, but just in general, I think, relationships and communication are so important. Those relationships, from consumers to retail accounts to your wholesalers, they really help funnel up to our co-packers, help us understand, anecdotal data. They help us understand trends. They help us challenge our current business. They help us to see some of our blind spots maybe. We need them to help work with us to be successful. So I really think that those relationships are super important. And I think, BK and I both gave examples throughout the last hour where, being able to phone a friend, whether it's a question to understand how something's going, what's working, what's not working, pays dividends. So I think that's super important. And as you grow, or whether you become more efficient or remain status quo, having those relationships is super, super duper important. And then I would say, ensuring the whole data piece that we've talked about today is, I think, being able to understand the data that you have, what data you don't have, being able to put it into a comprehensive or an understandable format so that you can see the data in a way that helps you problem solve or make decisions, so that you can work on the business. I think are, again, a really important thing. Don't jump in blind. Make sure that you understand, that data. So
yeah, it's in some ways a wild, wild west out there. Doesn't mean you jump in completely blind, right? So prepare, get lean, stay nimble and ready to move into these new categories. Ultimately, making sure they're a right cultural fit, a right market fit for you and your wholesale network. I think, a lot of old principles that still ring true in the new world, and it's just really about double down, right? Long are the days of double-digit growth. We just got to get lean, get creative, and keep our ears to the ground and listen to what consumers want. I think that's as best as I can summarize it today. So, with that, BK, Amy, I want to thank you so much for attending, and thank you to all the attendees for calling in today. I hope you found this conversation helpful and productive, and maybe assessing the path that you guys all have on your own journey. And we look forward to seeing you out there, and wish you all continued success. So thank you again, BK, Amy, and Craft Beer and Brewing, and we'll catch you soon.
Perfect. Thanks to you, Nate, and thanks Encompass again. Appreciate it.
Cool. All right, guys. We'll see you.
Take care.